Welcome to everyone joining us this afternoon for this research seminar on translational relationships, embodying dialogue and translating with care, with translators in residence at the BCLT, Paul Russell Garrett and Annie Rutherford. Paul translates from Danish and Norwegian and has a keen interest in drama and has translated a dozen plays and heads a mentoring program for aspiring theatre translators with foreign affairs. He has also translated a score of books and serves on the committee of the Translators Association and is chair of DELT, the Association of Danish English Literary Translators. And Annie Rutherford is a writer, translator, and project leader, a maker of things with words, as well as a champion for poetry and translated literature in all its guises. Her current projects include Query Points, a psychogeography walk about queerness, civility, and landscape in Dorothy Wordsworth and Annette von Droste-Hülshoff. She translates mostly from German and as well as from French, Russian, and Belarusian, and specializes in poetry, translation, and prose. In this seminar, Paul and Annie will discuss the insights, challenges, and questions that have emerged from their research projects while at BCLT as translators in residence, as well as exploring the intersections between the two projects. Paul will investigate how collaborative approaches common in the theatre world can not only be applied to theatrical dialogue, but also used to enrich translation across other literary genres, in particular dialogue in fiction. Paul will look at exercises and techniques widely used in the rehearsal room and how they could be used to help literary translators better embody their texts. And Annie will explore practical and ethical translation questions through the lens of ethics of care. As a feminist intervention into ethics, the ethics of care holds up care as a possible alternative to traditional understandings of justice. An ethics of care approach to translation removes the hierarchy between author and translator and instead creates a relational network between equal participants and raises a number of questions that Annie will be dealing with. So we're going to start with Paul and then Annie. Each of them will talk for about 20 minutes or so. They have PowerPoint presentations they're going to share. And then we'll have a Q&A session and open discussion. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, which is enabled.
Thank you for that, Stacey. Sorry for the momentary lapse there, just trying to find my way around there. And I'm just working on a space that's not familiar to me, so I'll just be looking off to the side to look at my notes here. So apologies for looking away from you there. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Stacey. Just to start in explaining my approach to translating dialogue and theatre and translating literary texts as well, I just want to preface my research topic with a bit of background on my move into the field of literary translation. I describe myself as a working class literary and theatre translator from Norwegian and Danish into English, as well as a workshop facilitator and language tutor. After earlier careers in retail and catering, around 20 years ago, I set off on a very different journey when I began university as a mature student. I studied modern languages at university, the first in my family to attend, where I completed a degree in Scandinavian studies with a single module in translation, which had a heavy focus on theory. When I finished my degree, I had no notion of becoming a translator, but I had acquired a deep passion for my main language of study, Danish, and its literature, as well as a broader interest in Scandinavian literature and Nordic literature. A few years after completing my degree, I set off into two entirely new fields, translation and language tutoring, and I've been working in both fields for almost 15 years now. Although I studied at university, my work as a translator and as a tutor is grounded in practice rather than theory, shaped more by instinct and lived experience than by any formal training, which is something I'm going to focus on here. Let me just, great. So this is, I don't know if you read Danish, but this is from the first play I translated, The Contract Killer. And this is how I became a translator. Most of my work has involved literary fiction, but my first translation was a Danish play, which was both staged and published in the UK. As Ceci mentioned, I've since translated a dozen plays, but I've had no formal training in either translation or in theatre. Growing up in a working class suburb of Vancouver, theatre was completely unknown to me. When I discovered theatre as an adult, I found it rather stuffy, very traditional, and not particularly engaging. However, that changed when my wife began training in the Meissner technique, which focuses on actors responding truthfully with each other and their surroundings. I started to attend readings and shows by her newly founded theatre company, Foreign Affairs, and I was hooked. A few years later, when I stumbled across a little-known play in Denmark, I immediately wanted to translate it. Again, with no formal training in how to go about that, I was still confident I could do it, and I sensed something very familiar about the characters in the play. So after patching together a hasty translation, some of the actors my wife collaborated with were invited to take part in an informal reading of The Contract Killer over dinner and drinks. Following that reading, I began to shape my translation based on the particular quirks of these actors, their voices, intonations, mannerisms, as well as their characteristics. And I absolutely loved translating dialogue. When I started translating other literary genres, whether it was children's or young adults, literary fiction, plays, or nonfiction, dialogue continued to be my favorite aspect of translation. My route into theatre and translation was anything but conventional, but somehow it worked for me. That early experience of translating a play without any formal training, but guided by instinct, community, and collaboration, laid the foundation for everything that has followed. It not only sparked my love for translating dialogue, but also introduced me to a way of working that felt dynamic, responsive, and highly creative. In this talk, I'll explore how that instinctive beginning has evolved through key ideas I've been engaging with during my time as translator-in-residence at BCLT: collaboration, voice, practice as research, and dialogue. I'll also share the outcomes of 2 practical workshops that brought these ideas together, working with other writers, translators, and performers. My late introduction to the theatre world with Foreign Affairs brought me together with actors, directors, producers, and other creatives, where I had the privilege of being in the room with professional theatre practitioners. Not only was I a theatre translator, I soon began to consider myself a theatre maker. Going from being the only translator in the room to entering a space filled with translators after I was accepted onto the BCLT summer school, the Norwegian workshop with Kari Dixon. This was my first introduction to the idea of collaborative translation, which opened my eyes to the multitudes of possibilities within translation. That translation was not simply the transfer of one word in one language to another word in another language. After a few more summer schools, a number of co-translations, including an entire trilogy of Norwegian fantasy novels co-translated with my colleague Sean Mackey, I began to work more closely with Foreign Affairs after this. I helped establish their theatre translator mentorship, based in large part on my experiences becoming a theatre translator. And there I was able to continue to collaborate with other theatre makers, experimenting with rhythm, music, movement, and numerous other facets that continue to shape my approach to translating theatre and my approach to other translations. The solitary nature of translation is often discussed, that translators are locked away and never get to see other people. But for me, that has seldom been the case. Translation is and always has been a collaborative act for me, bearing in mind all the different professionals a translator might work with, even while working at home from their desk. And that is including whether you're working with publications or on stage. In the book Collaborative Translation from the Renaissance to the Digital Age, the authors boldly state that all translation is collaborative, and I think those are words every translator should remember. I mentioned earlier how I discovered a love for translating dialogue. However, later on, when speaking with colleagues, I learned that few of them enjoyed translating dialogue. In fact, some of them even disliked it. I wondered why they felt that way. Or rather, I wondered why I enjoyed translating dialogue so much. That question is what led me to apply for the BCLT Translator-in-Residence, an attempt to discover why translating dialogue seemed to be like the Marmite among translators. So The research question that I formulated when I was applying for the residency listed a number of the questions I wanted to investigate during my residency. I'm going to talk about a few of these and share some discoveries I made along the way. I don't think I'm going to read the entire application to you because there were a lot of different elements to it. And looking back on it now, I realized that it was a very ambitious proposal, mostly in a good way, but there were a lot of different aspects to it, which I thought were fairly straightforward and easy, but turned out to be a lot more complicated when I began to investigate them. And yeah, the project I had proposed opened up far more pathways than I could possibly follow in a 4-month residency. However, it did lead me to some questions that mattered a lot to me, that became very important to me. One discovery to emerge alongside my research was of a more personal nature. I've never felt particularly at ease in an academic setting. However, engaging with my research questions in combination with my theatre and translation practice has begun to change that. Though my time at BCLT has been quite short, these initial inquiries sparked a desire for further research, particularly around the concept of voice, which I hope will help me develop strategies to create authentic characters and dialogue in my translation. I've always found the concept of voice an intriguing challenge for a translator. From the very first translation that I showed you before, with the actors just around the dinner table there, reading out the different parts there. But trying to recapture the original tone in the target language, whether it's the authentic voice of the author or that of the characters. I was fortunate enough to receive some crucial guidance from Ceci early on in my mentorship, sharing some reading on the topic of voice. I had thought voice would be rather straightforward, but Peter Elbow's chapter in the book, Voices on Voice, revealed it to be a far more complex than I expected. Rather than clear answers, I found more questions and a growing sense of just how elusive voice really is. While I didn't pursue this topic in depth, I'll share some of my discoveries. One aspect of voice that I found particularly interesting is that when we read to ourselves, when we read quietly or silently, our vocal cords are still active. There's nerve activity, sometimes even muscular activity in the vocal cords, almost an echo of speech. That fed directly into my thinking around embodying a text, not just reading it, but physically inhabiting it. For me, that's where theatre and translation meet. Voice is also a metaphor, like a table leg. Tables don't literally have legs, but the metaphor helps us to understand how a table functions. Voice is a term that everyone seems to use without fully understanding what it encompasses. I realized I had been approaching the concept of voice far too broadly. What started as a key area of interest quickly became one I approached with caution, not because I didn't find it interesting, but because the more I read, the more slippery it became. As Peter Elbow admits in his exploration of voice in Voices on Voice, the more I seemed to know about it, the less certain I became, and the less I actually knew. I found myself nodding in agreement. People use the metaphor of voice to refer to many things: the act of writing, the presence of the writer in the text, a sense of authenticity or truth, or even how the reader responds to a text. It can be an individual identity or a constructed one. Sometimes voice is about how we express ourselves, sometimes about how we approximate or borrow from others. It's rooted in the physical, our breath, our body, but plays out in the abstract space of writing. Peter Elbow goes on to describe voice not as the writer's presence on the page, but as resonance, a kind of emotional echo in the reader. That idea has stuck with me. If I experience resonance, he writes, it's more likely to reflect a good fit between the words and myself, while the writer's self is nowhere to be found. That shift from authorial intent to embodied reception is key. And when I consider my work in theatre, voice isn't just metaphorical, it's literal, it's embodied and performed. We constantly ask, can you say this line out loud? Is it speakable? Does it breathe? What effect does it have? So although I chose not to delve more deeply into the concept of voice, The questions it raised linger: notions of authenticity, fidelity, the translator's role, and the shifting hierarchy between author and translator. My initial understanding of voice reaffirms my thinking of translation as embodied reading, not simply capturing the author's voice, but bringing the text to life in another language, body, and cultural moment. My first question when I started looking into dialogue is, what is dialogue? So I went straight to the dictionary and I found a couple of definitions I'll share with you. From Cambridge: conversation written for a book, play, or film, formal talks between opposing groups. And from Merriam-Webster: a conversation between two or more persons, a written composition in which two or more characters are represented as conversing, an exchange of ideas and opinions, a discussion aimed at a resolution. All of these meanings connect. Dialogue is exchange, conflict, and representation. It's about authenticity too. How do we capture that on the page? I keep returning to the discussion from the translation of fictive dialogue, trying to define what dialogue does. One way of expressing dialogue is that it is written to be spoken as if not written. That tension lies at the heart of good dialogue and translation too. In fiction or drama, dialogue reveals everything: character, class, region, time, even power dynamics. But how do you carry that across languages and cultures? Dialect, slang, tone, they signal connection, distance, power. Translators must carry these layers across. So the question isn't what is dialogue, but how do we accurately represent it? Once again, this topic has proved bigger than I imagined in my pursuit of making discoveries about voice and dialogue. So instead of diving even deeper into research to answer these questions, I turn to what I do best: my practice. I was encouraged to read some research into practice as research by Robin Nelson. I initially had called this practice-based research or practice-led research, which, as I understand it, is a framework for completing postgraduate studies, one that is based on an arts practice rather than through the traditional academic model. This felt particularly relevant as I wrestled with the elusive nature of voice and dialogue, perhaps offering a hands-on approach to study these questions. I've come around to Nelson's preferred term, practice as research. As he argues, this equates practice and research instead of suggesting the traditional Western hierarchy of research over practice. I would really encourage other translators to look into this approach, because I believe it's something many of us already do in our daily practice, reflecting on our work, adapting our methods, and constantly seeking to improve our translations. That ongoing critical self-reflection is in many ways at the heart of PAR. One of the keys of PAR is documentation of the practice in question. So I'll now look at some practical workshops I undertook during my residency. This was the title of the first workshop I did at BCLT. I also did another workshop around the same time. I was asked to lead a workshop by NOLA, the Norwegian Literature Abroad, and the Norwegian Embassy in London for a group of Norwegian to English translators to celebrate the work of Nobel Prize in Literature winner Jon Fosse. I'm going to discuss these two practical workshops and some of the discoveries and questions they raised. Here you'll see some of the feedback from the first workshop at BCLT here. These are some of the surprises and takeaways that some of the participants shared after the workshop. The aim of this workshop, this was to translate my experiences working with plays and translation to translating dialogue in other forms of fictions and share that with other translators. This took place at UEA on the 26th of March. Primarily, these were Masters in Literary Translation students and creative writing students, as well as writers and members of the public. There was limited theater experience in the room. We analyzed a text I brought with me from my translation of Christina Hesselhold's Vivian. Not a dialogue, but a challenging text, a stream of consciousness text that runs on for several pages without any full stop. We started by reading a selected passage aloud in stages. First to ourselves, out loud, but quietly to ourselves. We then read it aloud to our partner, someone sitting beside us. We then broke up into groups and read aloud in a group, going in the round, as we call it, going from one person to the next and circling around. We used actor-informed techniques to explore the text, using movements, which was guided by punctuation, with establishing preset rules for different types of punctuations, turning and moving on different types of punctuations. Another activity was articulating first vowels only, and then consonants only, in an attempt to explore sound, structure, and emotional texture. We then experimented with pacing, speeding up, slowing down, to observe tonal and narrative shifts. A few observations from that first workshop. There was one particular response that really stood out to me, and that was someone had experienced dizziness as they were moving around the room and reading their text. And upon reflection, this made perfect sense to me, given the stream of consciousness text they were reading, which I still to this day remember translating years and years ago, where I constantly had to circle back through different parts of the text to find out where the different threads of the conscious stream of consciousness were connected. So dizziness definitely made sense. There was a few things that I would do differently if I were to do this workshop again. I was initially not sure how a non-dialogue prose would work for this exercise, but it took on a new life when it was performed, as it were. A few more instructions on reading vowels and consonants could be used in future, as the participants were very conscious of how they should say them. So in the next workshop that I conducted, I gave deeper instructions on how to pronounce the vowels and consonants. I would also like, if I was to do this again, to introduce a collaborative rewrites after each of these exercises to see how a translation might change based on some of the discoveries they'd made. The workshop confirmed my experience that theater exercises are not just warm-ups for actors. They can be powerful analytical tools to reveal hidden structures and effective rhythms in the text. Ones that I can use to work through challenging dialogue and texts in different genres, not intuitively as I've done in the past, but through concrete work. The next workshop was, as I mentioned, was at the Norwegian Embassy with translating the work of Nobel Prize winner Jon Fosse. Here, the participants translated a text in advance and brought that to the room. We worked through a similar set of exercises, and despite a very different group of people, these were all professional translators of different experiences, a few with experience of translating theater, one with acting experience. The results were quite similar to the previous workshop. A few of the themes that stood out for me: the musicality, the repetition, reading out loud, and others, rhythm, movement. I think the biggest thing for a lot of people was a lot of them would read their texts out loud before they submitted them, but they never tried moving around with them, and that really helped them find the rhythm of the text there. I think the biggest challenge with this group of translators was they were very experienced. They translated the text in advance, and they were keen to discuss individual words, individual sentences, the lack of punctuation in the text that Jon Fosse is famous for, and it took a little bit of effort just to bring them around to trying some of these different techniques there instead of discussing words as we translators are prone to do. I think, again, an additional retranslation phase would be effective for this. So in conclusion, how can theater practice help me when translating dialogue? Throughout my residency, I kept returning to a question Ceci asked me at the beginning, which helped me to narrow the focus of my inquiries. What strategies used in theater translation can be used to improve translator skills in writing and editing dialogue in fiction? I'm not sure any translator will consider a translation theory to translate a book before, but translators will take strategies or approaches to a book, whether these are conscious choices or otherwise. They will think about how they're going to translate a given project in advance. If I'm like other translators, we often reflect on past projects. I often think back on projects I've completed years ago and wonder how I might do them differently, or what it was that worked so well in that translation. Self-reflection seems a natural part of what we do, and I can only assume that is the same for other translators. And I would consider translators to value these reflections, jot them down, pop them in a jar, a folder, a box, so you can dig them out and think about them in future, and think about how they might impact your next translation. I feel like I've only just begun to scratch the surface on some of the topics that I've explored, but I'll continue to explore them and explore different ways to reflect on my practice and learn from the reflections of other practitioners in the field. This may not consciously change how I approach a translation, but I'm beginning to accept that the mere act of self-reflection is enough to improve our approach to translation. The imperfections, tangents, and unanswered questions from this process are not loose ends, but beginnings, ideas I'll keep returning to. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. That was wonderful. I love the idea of thinking about reflections and just putting them in a jar, as opposed to a document or anything more structured, just pulling them out at random. Please bear with me for the awkward shuffle of my screen sharing while I get my presentation up. It's lovely to be here. Thanks so much to all of you for being here. Thanks to Ceci and the team at BCLT for having me. It's been absolutely wonderful to have the time and space that the residency provided, and it's been great working alongside Paul as well. As Ceci said, I've been looking at translation through the lens of the ethics of care, which is a school of thought that really appealed to me, but which I didn't know a huge amount about before I started the residency. I'm going to start by giving a brief introduction to the ethics of care before discussing a few different points raised by care ethicists, which I found particularly interesting in the framework of translation. Like Paul, I feel like I've really just scratched the surface here. So these are very much kind of the beginnings of thoughts and things I hope to kind of take further. The ethics of care. It's one of those things. Can people see my video? One sec, I will remove this. There, hopefully you'll be able to see the slide fine. The ethics of care is a feminist intervention into ethics. Emerging out of psychology, it has since spread to a number of other disciplines and has been used as a framework to approach topics from housing to childcare to ecofeminism to research. There doesn't seem to be much work on care ethics and translation so far. I did find a couple of things, thanks to Duncan for pointing out to me that there's actually a new anthology out on ethics of care and machine translation. And there's also a really interesting article by T. Saka about the ethics of care and translation, specifically in the context of her own role as a researcher working between cultures and languages. But generally, looking at literary translation by people, it's a fairly unmined field as far as I can see. In the words of Carol Gilligan, who's considered the originator of the ethics of care, it's an attempt to turn the tide of moral discussion from questions of how to achieve objectivity and detachment to how to engage responsively and with care. It asks us to move away from universalized moral stances to an understanding that ethical decisions and acts are contextual and relational, where the right action isn't based on an immutable moral law, but on close attention to the object of care, that is, the person you're interacting with, as well as your relationship with them and the circumstances surrounding you both. By asking us to pay close attention to the particularities of the object of care and the context we're acting in, care ethics recognizes the messiness of real life situations, acknowledging that we rarely make moral decisions in ideal situations where a perfect decision is possible, quite aside from the fact that an action of mine might help one person and harm another. We're always already implicated in capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, you name it. And so care ethics acknowledges that there often aren't any clear-cut solutions to ethical dilemmas, and that any particular resolution will have its limitations. Joan Tronto, who was a foundational thinker in care ethics, identifies 5 stages or qualities of ethical care: attentiveness to the object of care, taking responsibility ourselves for caring. Tronto differentiates here between responsibilities we choose and take on and more formal obligations which we discharge. Competence to carry out the care. Responsiveness, that is, the object of care needs to respond to the care in some way. And solidarity, which goes along with plurality, communication, trust, and respect. Tronto, along with other care ethicists, firmly views care as political. Being a part of society means being enmeshed in relations of care. To me, all of this has some really interesting parallels with translation. I think we can all agree that a rigid culture of critiquing translations as right or wrong without any recognition of the nuances of translation choices doesn't benefit anyone. And of course, as translators, we know best of all that we're rarely able to make a perfect decision, and that many translation choices result in loss or remainders of some kind. So if we apply Tronto's qualities of care, of ethical care, to translation, these might become attentiveness to the text and contexts of writing and translation, responsibility to the author, text, and readership, and possibly to other communities as well, the competence to translate well, and solidarity as an aim of translation practice. You'll notice I've gone from 5 to 4 bullet points here. I've really struggled to apply Tronto's idea of responsiveness to translation. So if you have a suggestion for this, please do put it in the chat. I'd be really interested to hear it. Virginia Held describes caring as, and I quote, a matter of practice and art as well as of knowledge, which I think is another parallel with translation. I'm thinking here about Kate Briggs' musings as to whether translation is an art or a craft. But I also think it's an important point to raise that caring isn't simply a value or an emotion, it's something we do, not something we feel. Of course, as translators, we often care deeply about the texts we translate, but even when we're translating a commissioned piece that we might not have chosen for ourselves, the ethics of care can still provide a really interesting framework with which to approach it. So I want to raise a few points that have tugged at my attention while I've been working on the residency. Again, a lot of these are thoughts that are very much in their infancy and questions I'm still pondering, so please do take these as the start of a conversation. I'd love to hear other folks' thoughts and reflections on these. As I've said, the ethics of care shies away from absolutes and instead emphasizes paying close attention to the care receiver and the context in order to decide what to do and how to act. And I really liked this quote by Joan Tronto: even to think about methods as the way to approach knowledge starts with some presumptions about the world. I have to confess, I found this very validating. I always get a bit impatient when it comes to more abstract conversations around translation theories. I'm aware that's ironic given that I'm the one with the slideshow with a lot of quotes, but we'll take it. So this to me was a really strong reminder that the text we're translating and the context we're working in should always be the starting point for any decisions we make about the approach we're going to take to translating. Virginia Held talks about the ethics of care as a form of moral inquiry rather than moral theory. And I think this is a really interesting distinction to make, a reminder that our starting point should always be questions and questioning, as opposed to coming to any translation with some kind of cookie-cutter theory which we plan to apply. Beyond simply asking us to pay attention to a single object of care, though, the ethics of care is insistently relational. As Carol Gilligan says, to organize relationships in terms of attachment rather than in terms of equality changes the way human connection is imagined, so that the images or metaphors of relationship shift from hierarchy or balance to network or web. The move from hierarchy to web firstly opens up our relationship with the author to be one that's reciprocal. The author isn't accorded all the authority, and equally the translator isn't accorded all the power. And with this, we can think of both the source text and the translation as dynamic, with the ability to feed into each other. The shift also opens up a space to think about other relationships that might play into a translation and the other subjects we might feel responsibility towards. This might be our readership or our colleagues or particular communities who are depicted in or affected by the text. One care theorist, Nell Noddings, argues that we are more obliged to care for people with whom we're already in relation, or where there is the possibility of us becoming so. I would make it clear I'm not sure that I agree with this on a broader ethical level, and a number of other care ethicists don't either. If you want to enjoy some classic academic cattiness, I highly recommend looking up Tronto's response to Noddings on this. But in the context of translation, I think it does prompt some interesting questions. When I first read it, it made me think about the responsibility I feel towards the contemporary authors I've translated, as opposed to the dead authors. But perhaps a more interesting perspective would be whether, when translating a dead author, we decide that our responsibilities towards a living community affected by the text outweigh our responsibility towards the author. I don't think there's a clear-cut answer to this. To be a true translator and a true care ethicist, it depends on the context. Noddings also argues that, quote, no institution or nation can be ethical. It does not meet the other as one caring or as one trying to care. If we decide that we agree with this, then that web of relationships that I mentioned earlier doesn't actually include publishers, and it doesn't include the text source country either. By this logic, we can have obligations to these entities, with that distinction of Joan Tronto's, but not responsibilities. Instead, our web of relationships might include editors that we work closely with, or particular communities from that country we feel a responsibility towards. Again, I think this is debatable and contextual, but I do think it provides a useful prompt to consider who we're translating for and how they impact on the translation. I've been talking a lot about the other subjects who might feed into a translation or who we might feel responsibility towards. But the thing that really surprised me in reading about care ethics was the emphasis that was also placed on the self. It's sometimes assumed that to be caring means to be selfless, and Gilligan makes it really clear that this isn't and shouldn't be the case. The ethics of care rests on relationships and, as I quote, to be selfless means not to be in relationship. So yeah, she expands here. Relation requires connection. It depends not only on the capacity for empathy or the ability to listen to others and learn their language, of course, a great metaphor here for translation, or to take their point of view, but also on having a voice and having a language. Now, I partly wanted to bring this up because I want to be clear that arguing for an ethics of care approach to translation does not mean effacing the translator. The fact that translators, like many workers in the art, care deeply about their work is often used as an excuse for low pay and poor working conditions, and that's absolutely not what care ethics is about. But I also think this is an important reminder to ask ourselves what it is we're bringing to a translation. Our baggage and our biases, sure, but also our strengths and the things that draw us to a text. If we're going to map out or consider the web of relationships that surround a text and our translation of it, then we need to make sure we locate ourselves within that. Alison M. Jagger says that care encourages reflexive consideration of what the agent brings to the situation, her interests, her location, the context, her warrant for intervention. Taking the time for this reflexive consideration, taking the time to locate ourselves in relationship to the translation and the various subjects and communities around it, can help us be more aware of our own reactions to the text, and in doing so can perhaps help us to be more conscious of the reasons behind translation approaches or choices that we might otherwise have settled on without much thought. Now, we might still decide to go ahead with those approaches, but I think there's a value to these decisions being made more consciously and reflexively. The other thing that I really appreciated about Gilligan's insistence on the importance of the self, the importance of having a voice and having a language, is the reminder that as translators, we're never objective, and that's a good thing. It's often said that translators are the closest readers, and unless we're reading very dry nonfiction, most of us read for some kind of emotional connection. The emotional reactions we have to texts, the imagined relationships we build up with characters, I hope this isn't just me, feed into our translations and can tell us a lot about how to translate. I really like Barnes and Branley's points here that emotion's the source of important understandings. For me, as quite an emotional translator, this was again quite a validating thing to consider, but it was also a good reminder to let myself sit with emotions when I'm translating and to be more conscious of what's prompting them and how that might feed into my translation. I'm assuming the chat is not somebody telling me they can't hear me, but I'm going to check this. No, we're grand. Beautiful. I want to finish up with some thoughts around translation, care, and solidarity. The ethics of care emerged out of Gilligan's critique of psychological studies, which were only carried out on boys and men, with the results being taken as universal. And in subsequent studies, girls and women were then measured against those results and considered deficient. So the question of whose voices we hear, whose voices are accepted, has always been at the heart of care ethics. Of course, this ties in with questions of who gets translated and who gets to translate. And as translators, these are boundaries we should always be pushing to extend. I think there's also a tie-in, though, with how we are expected to translate and possibly the editorial choices we may need to push back against. As I've said, the ethics of care offers an alternative to universalist thinking, with Margaret Urban Walker saying that, and I quote, "Some characteristically modern forms of universalist thinking may project a sort of moral colonialism. The subjects of my moral decision disappear behind uniform policies I must impartially apply, precisely because they were forged with an eye to actual colonialism." This reminded me of one of my favorite translation events, which I highly recommend looking up if you haven't watched it already. It's the National Centre for Writing's digital event, Who is This Mythical English Reader?, with a number of fantastic translators, including Anton Hur and chaired by Danny Hahn. You can find the event on YouTube, and it explores much more eloquently than I can summarize how the standardized British and US American middle-class Englishes that editors often expect us to translate into sideline so many other Englishes and so many possible readerships and ways of approaching a text. The attentiveness to the particularities of text, context, and our relationship with the translation that care ethics asks of us reminds us repeatedly to be open to all of the possibilities of translation and translating. And I think this opens up ways of thinking about translation as solidarity, translation as activism. Finally, as I've already mentioned, equating translation with care does not stop it being work. On the contrary, as any parent can tell you, caring is labour. Joan Tronto states that a feminist approach to caring needs to begin by broadening our understanding of what caring for others means, in terms of the need to restructure broader social and political institutions if caring for others is to be made a more central part of the everyday lives of everyone in society. I've largely focused in the last 15 minutes on how the ethics of care can offer something of a framework for a conscious and reflexive translation praxis. But I wanted to finish up by saying that caring is also about unionizing. It's about the networks of care that we build up with each other as translators and as workers in the book industry. And I'm very grateful that places like the British Centre for Literary Translation offer spaces to forge and grow these connections. So thank you, and thank you very much for being here.
Hi, thank you, Annie. Thank you, Paul. This has been great. It's wonderful to see how your projects have grown from that first articulation in your residency applications. And I wanted to go back a little bit about how your projects began. What was the motivation behind each of your projects when you first applied for the translation residency? And by motivation, I mean not only what you thought that you wanted to work on or investigate, but also a personal interest. You know, what made you want to do this in particular as translators, as human beings.
Paul, do you want to jump in first? No, okay. I think for me there were two things, and one was that, and I'm sure a lot of the translators will recognize this feeling. I think often, particularly as freelancers, we kind of are in a bit of a hamster wheel, and you sort of jump from one translation to another and one project to another. Either because you're desperately trying to earn the rent, or because you've got past that point but haven't yet learned how to say no to projects. And so we don't actually have the time and the space to kind of stop and think about how we're translating and why, which I think is a bit ironic, because again, we all got into this because we love it and we care deeply about what we do, but we don't always have the time to explore that. So that for me was really exciting, of just having this framework where I was able to kind of take something I was interested in and run away with it. And specifically on my project, I listened to a podcast episode on care ethics and sourdough bread, and had lots of thoughts about how sourdough bread was like translation, and thought that would be really interesting to explore. And sadly, there has been very little bread in my project, but that was the starting point. I can share the link for that in the chat. It's also an interesting listen if you've enjoyed this.
I quite like that, the anecdotal, but it's true. It's about finding the time and the space, and I think that what you're saying, this jumping from one project to another is a very real way in which translators actually live and work, and there's very little time to think and reflect. And Paul, you talked about reflection as well, but what was the personal motivation behind your project?
Yeah, that was really interesting to hear, Annie. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, the question that I've been asking about dialogue was one of the things that I've wanted to know for a long time, but really it was probably triggered by about a year and a half ago. I was asked to do some teaching at UCL, University College London. And I went back there to do some Danish teaching and to teach a few other courses that I wasn't super knowledgeable about, but I had to do a lot of reading and research into them. But that experience sort of made me appreciate the setting again, and maybe it sort of inspired a desire to sort of seek a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more research, and trying to find a space for that. And what better space than BCLT and this amazing residency that you offer. And I think, as you said, yeah, self-reflection, looking at practices, but also for me as a practitioner, so not just as a translator, but as a teacher as well, both of languages, but also of translation and training other translators. I really wanted to explore some different parts of my own practice that might help me as I train other translators.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to that question of reflection on practice, because it seems that we are going back to the question of practice research, or research practice-led research, or practice-based research, or artistic research. Although Robin Nelson, his preferred term is practice as research, or practice research. I think that it wasn't our intention when we thought up the residencies at BCLT that the resident translators should contribute to the BCLT research seminar series. It so happened that with the inaugural translators, both of them, Olivia Helwell and William Gregory, had in their projects, in their applications, questions that we thought, oh, this is super interesting. This could actually be the starting point of a conversation, a mini research project, because again, we are very much aware that 4 months is not a long time. And we therefore invited the translators in residence to take part in this BCLT research seminar series. And that was a revelation for us, because we talk a lot about the translator as reader, the translator as writer, the translator as researcher. Yeah, there's a lot of research that goes into the translation of a text. However, this is something else. This is thinking that the practice of translation can actually be the starting point for a critical or theoretical inquiry. That to me is very, very exciting, that the practice generates knowledge, and that in order to get that knowledge recorded in a way, you have to be interested in reflecting on the practice, but also keeping note of the practice, as you were showing those post-its, after a workshop, thinking, okay, what has happened here? What happened as a result of the exercises? So in a way, I want to ask you questions about the residency, and through thinking through more theoretical questions from the practice, what have been your insights then as you approach the ending of the residency? Those questions that you had initially, and the practice that you did, the workshops and the reading around and the reflective work that you've done, what insights have you gained through this process? Difficult question, I know.
It's a big question. Yeah, I'm
a
thinking,
big question.
I think I'll go first because Annie, you took the last one there. Yeah, I'm so glad that you have actually instigated this or maintained this research seminar for the BCLT translators in residence, because although it is, at least for me, it was a rather terrifying experience, but it really it kind of focused all of the work that I've been doing over the past few months, and made me really look at both what I want, what I do, and what I want to do, what I want to be doing. So both my current practice and how I want to be working in future. And I think that self-reflection is really important, and that has been one of the keys for me. And I've always done that, but I don't think it's informed as much how I continue to work on future projects as much as I would like it to. So I'm trying to incorporate more. I lost I had an updated slide on the last one there, and it's this lovely new thing that I've created. It's a little glass jar that we have, where I used to just pop in like comments or notes or translations or words or sentences that I really liked or thought I should remember, and I would pop them into a folder. And I've started popping them into this jar here, so, and then see through, so you can kind of see into it as well. So things that I can just note down in the moment and look back on them the next day, the next week, a year later, but to try and continue to just a constant process of self-reflection, and thinking about how ways I can apply that to future projects.
Yeah, in a way, let me just jump to this before Annie gives her answer. You did actually talk about that ongoing critical self-reflection, which is part of what translators do, that they reflect on the work, on why they take decisions that they take, and you learn from every translation project new ways of doing things. But having that space, and also being validated that is research, that you're generating knowledge. And I think that if I may say so, watching objectively your process over the last 4 months, from having this germinal idea for a project to actually having done the reading and having actually what you do is already practice research, and you've had the space now to develop it. So great, I'm very pleased to see that. Annie, your insights from your project.
I feel like I'm in life of insights. They all went into that talk. A really interesting thing was actually, so I also read the practices research book that Paul referenced, and I was working on the project that you mentioned. I apologize for making you say Annette van der Hulshoff without.
Oh yeah, that's difficult.
Yeah, it's not very kind to anyone. But I was working on this project, bringing Dorothy Wordsworth and Annette van der Hulshoff into kind of dialogue with each other. I'll share the website in the chat. It's so it's a choose your own adventure game, effectively, but with poetry and text. And that while I was reading the book and working on that, I realized that what we were doing was practices research, and I had very much seen it as a project that a friend and I had come up with over a glass of wine that I'd persuaded Creative Scotland to give us money for. So it was kind of gaining that larger framework of actually what we were working on was really interesting, and sort of, I think, helped me be more confident in that. So that was almost a kind of a side thing, but it was really nice seeing the project kind of feed into the different things I was working on. And then I think, similar to Paul, it was, I mean, again, I wanted to do the residency to kind of take that time and space and kind of have a breath and think about how I translate and why I translate the way I do. And actually, I hope that I'll take that forward of giving, again, like the kind of, I hope that I've come up with this sort of framework for approaching translation through the ethics of care. Um, and my aim would be to work with that going forward, and maybe have a little bit of a slower start to how I approach a particular text, but hopefully that'll help me to kind of engage with it more closely.
That's great. Taking your time, and finding the time and creating the space to reflect, and knowing that's validated, that's absolutely something that translators, if possible, should do. But it is also, I think, in a way, it is our role as academics to open up those spaces, the spaces that we can carve out of our meager existence and budgets, that we can create those spaces. Because I think that for a long time now, translation studies scholars have actually been calling for a great engagement, a much more open engagement of academia or the discipline, translation studies or literary translation studies, with translators. I'm recalling Susan Bassnett saying that, translation studies has to have a greater, more open engagement with translators. And I think that if we can incorporate them into research projects, if we can incorporate them into the space, the spaces like research seminar series, I think we all are richer as a result. I want to move on. First of all, I want to say to everyone, to participants, that there is a Q&A function, and so you can post your questions. I have one more question to ask both of you to do with how the two projects present links and synergies between them. And I think that's great. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, because it seems that you're both sort of highlighting collaboration, translation as collaborative practice. You're shifting from the traditional image of the literary translator working on their own towards collaboration, networks, and webs, and these relationships that we forge. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. How do you see this new way? Well, it's not new, but this emphasis on moving away from working on your own to being in relation with others?
I can start if you like. First of all, I want to thank Annie for from the start, when we both started this, she was very keen to collaborate, and I'm really glad we were able to work so closely together on a number of different things, sometimes just chatting over lunch about our different projects, and also one I've really enjoyed doing our blogs, which we've co-written together. They've been a lot of fun to work on. It's been really interesting to hear, Annie, when you were talking about your presentation, and even at times when we were discussing it, there was so much crossover between them, even though we've gone in very different directions, and maybe we've read some of the same things there as well. But talking about voices and fidelity and some of these different things, I really was interested in that, and interested that there was so much crossover but they've led in such really different ways. Yeah.
I think the interesting thing for both of us was actually that it's not like either of us had this epiphany of like, oh, and now we will work collaboratively. Like, we've also, I mean, Paul sort of said, like, from the start, his experience of translation was quite collaborative. And around the time that I started out in literary translation, I joined ETN, the Emerging Translators Network, which I, of course, highly recommend to anyone who isn't already a member, and posted something saying, hi, I'm Annie, I'm interested in translation events, I'm based in Scotland, and got a message from Rebecca DeVelt, who I have done a huge amount of co-translation with since then, or a fair amount of co-translation with since then, and have been mistaken for as how much work we've done with each other. And from very early on, we were kind of spitballing ideas back and forth, and she set up the wonderful Translators Stammtisch at the Goethe Institute Glasgow. I know a couple of folk from there are here today. So I think for both of us, it was, yeah, again, it wasn't that it was revelatory or anything, but it was unusual talking about it, I think. Simply, we don't, yeah, there's this sort of, I don't know if folk remember that meme that was like, what my friends think I do, what my parents think I do, what society thinks I do, what I think I do, what I actually do. And all of those are, I think, for translators, variations of someone sitting alone at a desk, and yet actually what we actually do. There's so much of this and of conversations over coffee or over wine, or eavesdropping on conversations so as to be able to try and get the right tone for a dialogue that you're translating. And yeah, I guess to be a bit of a broken record, it kind of comes back to the reflexiveness, that sort of just being more aware of that collaboration and how it feeds into our work and the possibilities of it was really lovely.
Can I just mention one more thing? I was also thinking that I like the idea of, I think it was in the book on collaborative translation, is that just breaking this myth of the solitary translator. Although we might spend a lot of time at home on our own, but we collaborate constantly with any number of people. So whenever people say, you know, like it's, I think it's just collaborative by nature, and I really believe that. So yeah, but yeah, just that point.
Yeah, that's great. And also, I was just thinking about collaboration will actually lead to projects. You know, the minute you start talking, you think, oh, we could do this together, and then the project, you know, you continue to talk about the project, and then perhaps possibilities are explored in terms of who can fund this. You know, who can fund this project. And you open up the network, you know, you go to people that you know, you talk about it some more, and someone might say, oh, I know of some funding. And then suddenly you're working on something that is fully funded, and you have also that possibility of you know, making an income, because you are all freelancers as translators, and you're, as you said earlier on, you jump from project to project. So collaboration and networking will also generate further projects. So that's something worth looking into. I'm aware that people are not posting questions.
So there's a couple in the Q&A, and there's actually a couple in the chat as well.
Okay.
So...
Okay, yes, there are some questions. So yes, a question from Anna. Have you enjoyed the process of writing the blogs? I loved reading them. I want more. So
that's very good, because there is a draft that we need to finish, which will be sent to be published soon. I've really enjoyed it. Please don't say that you haven't, Paul. That would be quite sad at this point.
No, I have as well, and I'm looking forward to reading the last one. And I mean, I don't know. I feel like we should continue to do some more here.
I think both. So far we had one blog post on collaborating with other translators and one on collaborating with our authors, and both of them kind of happened because I got a bit annoyed at people talking about not wanting to collaborate with other people or completely misunderstanding what co-translation is, and was like, we should write a blog post about it. It's the lengthiest subtweet ever, basically. So it was very nice to have the space with which we could do that, and we've got a post that we've almost finished, which is actually about making an income as a translator, and kind of the at the Assembly of Literary Translators the day before LBF, people were talking about tapas careers, which both of us really liked the idea of. So we sort of developed that a bit.
And I think that goes in with your what you were talking about towards the end of your talk there about unionization and translators working together. This is part of the sharing of information, that we can help each other and hopefully make our lives a little bit easier and maybe a little bit easier to make a living as a translator.
Yeah, absolutely. But the blogs are great. We were talking about space and the need to have that space, or find that space to reflect. And the blog allows you to put it in writing and to create a resource. I find them invaluable as a tool to direct, as a tool for teaching, you know, that I can direct my students on the MA in literary translation. Oh, go and read this blog on editing or, you know, developmental editing or on collaboration, that resource is out there now, you know, and that we are sort of creating a bank, as it were, of reflections on different aspects of literary translation practice. So thank you so much. I look forward to the next couple of blogs. And we've got a question from Duncan, a question for Annie. If the model is translator as care worker, what are the implications for the source text that is somehow in need of being translated?
That's a very good question that I should have considered before now. No, not that it's in need of being translated. And I mean, there are like really interesting folk like Niall Gallagher, who's a wonderful Gaelic poet, who actually has, well, certainly made an argument against self-translation from Gaelic into English because of the way that it kind of erases the original Gaelic poet. And I think Ocker as well, Kairani Barocca, I think, has talked quite interestingly about arguments against translation sometimes, the right to not be translated. I think there were a couple of things. One was that I obviously did talk a lot about the text, but yes, that was maybe my fault. I was kind of thinking more about this web of different connections of, okay, well, who do we owe care to, and is it who or what do we owe care to? Is it the text? Is it the author? Is it so I recently translated the novella The Jew's Beach, which is a novella by Annette van der Hulshof, yet again, and it's a 19th century novella, and it's partly about anti-Semitism, and so in some ways I felt to me there was a certain responsibility towards the Jewish community of doing that in a way that I hope was sensitive and thoughtful, particularly given that, again, it's a 19th century text and it both covers anti-Semitism and is like, you know, has some anti-Semitism within it, and how you juggle that. So kind of, I guess partly what I'd say is it's actually in some ways removing the focus from just the text as the object of care. But I also think that there can be texts that are in need of translation or in need of care. I mean, one of the reasons that I was approached to do The Jew's Beach is there are translations out there, and some of them are less good than others. And so, you know, sometimes you do think, okay, this is something where we want to offer a better translation, or offer a translation that is fitting for today or whatever. And I hope that's a vaguely helpful answer.
Yeah, I think it's a great answer, and I think that we need to continue to ask ourselves, you know, who do we owe the care to? And Paul posted, is it the reader?
Yeah, and I mean, I think, you know, there's obviously loads of conversations when we're talking about translating children's literature, and I mean, Ceci, I think you and I talked about this with Pippi Longstocking, that there are. I mean, fascinatingly, I'll simply say, in the English translation I read of Pippi Longstocking, her father is the king of the cannibals, and I can simply tell you that is not in the original. So there are some very fraught conversations around how do we translate children's literature that maybe is classic and isn't particularly politically correct, and how do we care for the children who are the readers today. I think it depends on the context, depends on the book, depends on the publisher, and who they're potentially bringing the book out for.
Yeah, I like that. It depends on, you know, because I think that again, if we think what is translation? Is it an art? Then there are no clear-cut answers to how we do it, you know. And I think that you were spot on to think about the ethics of care, recognizing the messiness. You know, just because we have a discipline like translation studies, you know, that has very many theories, doesn't mean that that's how we translate. That we certainly choose, pick and choose, you know, your pick and miss, your mix, your theory, and then you apply it. I am very much with Jean Bowes Bayer when she says that we don't apply a theory, you know, and Chantal Wright also takes Jean's idea argument against using the verb apply. And Chantal goes to the extent of bringing this metaphor. We don't apply a theory to a translation like we apply, like a can opener to a can of beans in order to open it. It's not a question of choosing and applying, but it's a question of looking at the text, responding to the text, caring for the text, and then judging, what am I going to do? What developing the translation strategy that is needed. And yes, you're going to probably feed from different theoretical approaches, but you're going to develop a strategy. I mean, that's certainly the way we teach translation here at UEA. Not dismissive of theories, but saying that we don't really just apply the theory or one theory, because it's clearly not going to work like that in that clear-cut mathematical or scientific way. So I think that your project invites reflection, and that continuing asking ourselves who is or what is the object of care in translation.
Ceci, there's a question in the chat. Do you mind if I take that one? It's from Penny.
Yes, please do.
And it's asking me, what approaches have you found effective when translating dialect from source to target language?
Yeah, brilliant.
And I don't have a concrete answer for that, but I think I think you almost have to have an approach that you take for each individual text that you work on there. I think from the languages that I work on, Danish doesn't tend to have a lot of dialects in text. They tend to write in a very standardized Danish, but Norwegian has lots of dialects, and dialects are embraced in Norway. There are many, many regional dialects, and they are, as well as having two official writing languages, there are also many regional dialects, and they are very well expressed in their literature. One strategy that I notice is from Don Bartlett, who is also based out here in Norwich. He translated a book by Roy Jacobsen, The Unseen, which I really recommend reading there. And in that, he developed a new dialect, because this was the original was an obscure Norwegian dialect. I can't remember if it was a real dialect or an invented one, but in either case, that doesn't transfer well to for example, you couldn't just use a Northern English dialect, or you couldn't use a dialect, because there are so many implications by choosing another dialect to translate into. So he created a new dialect, and I've only just started reading it, but I've heard about it for years and wanted to learn more about this dialect, and I actually want to know how this dialect was formed there. But that is one way of doing it. Other people have taken other strategies. Another colleague who translates from the Dutch, David McKay, he has also done a similar strategy, where there was a book he translated that had a combination of, I think it was French, Dutch, and German speech in it, and he ended up choosing a very specific. I think he chose a specific author as the way that this author wrote as a way of expressing this particular dialect, to give a certain feel to the text. So I think there's a different strategy for every text. That is the short answer.
Yeah, that's a very good answer, Paul. It depends on the text. It depends on what works for that text in particular, and then who you are translating for. Absolutely. And very often these decisions, big decisions as to the strategy, which is like, oh, do you invent a new dialect? Maybe it's also a conversation that has to be had with a publisher. So going back to the question of relationships and networks and who we work with. There are a couple of questions here. Thank you both, says Audrey, so much for your talks, really interesting. For Annie, do you think that the target audience could be included in thinking about ethics of care in translation? I think we took this question already. Yeah, and how do you think the target audience? Yeah, we talked about that. And then there's another question. Does caring have to be a feminist issue?
Oh, kind of one.
That's a big one.
I would argue yes. So I think there are kind of two things going on here. One is, and I would say, I mean very much feminist and not feminine. And I think feminism benefits everyone. So Carol Gilligan's, like I said, her research came out of these studies that had been done only with men and boys and were then applied to women. And I'm going to really badly summarize this, but basically the research was around people's ideas of justice, and without wanting to be essentialist, leaving aside the questions of nature and nurture and socialization and all of that, there was this recognition that generally boys and men were coming to questions the researchers were asking them with much more of a justice framework. So there was like here are the rules, and this is right and wrong, and these are the right or wrong things to do. And girls and women of the same age were being asked the same questions and were going, oh, well, I don't know. Like it sort of depends on the context. And the kind of most famous question was about like a man's wife is dying. A druggist has bought the drug that could save her life for $200, and he's insisting on selling it for $2,000. Should the man steal the drug in order to save the woman's life? And some of the boys said yes, some of them said no, but they had very clear-cut answers, and that was considered kind of good developmentally. And the girls were kind of going, oh, well, maybe there's another solution. Like, is there another way of dealing with this? And they were bringing in these kind of other relational aspects of like, is it possible to talk to the chemist and change this? So that was Gilligan originally came up with the care model as an alternative to the justice model. And she very much says they're two things that go hand in hand. We need both of them. That is something that later care ethicists have, some of them have taken further, some of them have disputed, but that's where it came from. So it was originally, again, a feminist intervention. But I also think simply in our society, care is largely carried out by women. Caregivers are largely women. If we're looking at care in a kind of more traditional way, not simply kind of caring for a translation or whatever. And because of that, it is something that is sidelined and not taken seriously. Elisa Strauss writes wonderfully about caregiving from a feminist perspective. I can recommend her writing on that. And there are lots of incredible feminist writers at the moment writing about sort of the crisis of caregiving in our society. And while then, I don't know how many of those people have engaged with like the theory of the ethics of care, it very much all ties in with each other. So that's a very rambly answer, but the short answer is yes.
That was a very good answer, Annie. And I think that the key thing is to think what, or to reflect on what feminist is, and again, I think that when it comes to translation, the Feminist Translation Network is posing all these questions, what is feminist translation? And my take is very broad in that, for me, a feminist attitude or strategy to translation has not got to do with the micro, but with the macro and the questioning of hierarchies. And we've been talking, both of us, the three of us, we've been talking about the hierarchies and challenging the hierarchies, and that power, that supposedly the author has over the text, or the source text has over the translator, etc. And thinking, well, let's think much more in terms of web, network, collaboration, and parity.
And I guess the other thing I'd say is I think the ethics of care is about intersectionality. It's about recognizing people, whether this is authors or readers or communities, coming to things with very different backgrounds, very different contexts, and paying attention to the particularity of that. And again, that was why I wanted that to raise the point about kind of the universalism being drawn from colonialism at the end of my talk. And I think for me, feminism has to be intersectional, and the ethics of care has to be intersectional. So I think there's a strong connection.
And translation
has to be intersectional.
Yeah. That's great. One of the things that I'm thinking about, thinking that, well, this is the 21st of May and your residency ends in 10 days exactly. What now, with these wonderful projects, and as I was listening to you both, I thought, oh, Paul should write this. Oh, Annie should write this. You know, and this is an open invitation. I think that these talks could actually be turned into articles. So we can talk about this some more at our next Zoom meeting, because I think that there is the potential of these talks becoming something more, you know, and more widely to be aiming at a wider audience. So I just want to make sure that I'm not missing any questions. Has anybody got anything they want to ask?
Penny also had one in the chat about AI. So what do you see as comparisons for translators in relation to the increasing use of AI? And is there any kind of ethical place for AI in literary translation? I would say that as long as AI has the environmental impact that it does, there isn't any ethical place for AI in many things. That's my feeling. Leaving aside all questions of translation. So I have to confess, there is this anthology on AI and the ethics of care. I have read some of, and I realized actually it looks really interesting. It's one of the things I'm planning on reading more of in the next 10 days. But it isn't really about human translators who I'm more interested in. But I would say AI to me can't care. It can't pay close attention to particularities. I don't know if anyone saw the thing today about the newspaper article with all of the fictional summer reads that an AI came up with. So to me, I have very negative feelings about it, but I know that some people may be more balanced there. Paul, I don't know how you feel.
I tried to keep an open mind on this topic, but I think it feels pretty much the same as you. There was a really interesting article that someone shared with me recently, and it was about in Denmark there were post-edited translations, and the question was, I think they were being claimed as for the question of copyright. Did the post-editors, could they claim copyright on it? And also claiming PLR based on the lending rights of these. And they've now said that these are not, you cannot copyright a post-edited text. So who is the translator in this text? So it's a AI that's translated it. It's a translator that has post-edited it, but they are not a translator. So what is this new thing? It's a whole can of worms that I don't feel like we're very prepared for.
Yeah, I think it raises the question of AI translation, raises a number of ethical questions. And as you said, Annie, it's also the environmental impact is huge. And this is only just now being talked about more widely. And yeah.
And
I think, yeah,
that is like from an ethics of care point of view, again, there actually is some really interesting writing around ethics of care and environmentalism and ecofeminism, and that, you know, the planet we live on is also an object of care and a thing that cares for us deeply. So that to me is actually really important.
So, but it certainly provides a very important framework through which to rethink AI translation. So it's worth pursuing that further. Yeah, well, I have to say that I really, really enjoyed working with you throughout the residencies. And as I said, the next conversation is what next? What to do with his project? The realization that 4 months is not a huge amount of time, that the projects in the very sort of nature of practice research have generated more questions than answers, or some answers, insights, but definitely more questions. So I would encourage you very much to take these questions forward and to continue to work on these projects. But as I said, in our next meeting, I think we should be talking about how we can convert this into something else. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Annie and Paul. This has been great. And thank you so much, everybody behind the BCLT screen. Sally and Anna and Duncan, thank you for everything.